Today I'm not feeling so good because I am sick, and there's also some emotional drama happening in my personal life. But that could be a good opportunity to talk about my recent trip to India, and in particular the most emotionally challenging parts of that trip. I think it's going to be 5, but let's see, maybe I add more, or maybe I can't even come up with 5. But that's the topic for today. So why don't you join me on a little hike at Manning Park in Australia, along with the little dog Kepler. Balancing up here is pretty difficult, so I might not be able to stay for long, but I think it's easy to say what the most emotionally difficult part of India was, and that is the amount of absurdly massive poverty. People living in absolute destitution, and you see thousands and thousands of people like that. It's actually crazy. People and animals as well. I'll put some pictures on screen. You know, we know that people are very poor, but right outside the temple that I visited, for instance, there are people without hands, people without arms. I didn't take any pictures of them because that would seem quite disrespectful. But seeing so many people with rotting teeth and just an immense suffering, when you look into their eyes, you can really see they are suffering. And when people grow old, there isn't any medical system to help them. And the people tended to be quite nice overall, even in the immense poverty. And I can't really communicate how emotionally difficult it is to see people in such levels of destitution and pain. And for them, there's really no way out if you're a poor person living in India. Many of them, you know, someone would come to mind. They might have cataracts in their eyes, they can barely see, and they sell tomatoes next to the street, next to a super noisy, busy street. And they're like maybe 60 years old, not much to look forward to in life. A lot of these people are connected to spirituality, which is great. It gives them something, just a bit of a rock in life. But if you go into India off the beaten track, like I did at Arunachala and Chidambaram temple, wow, the amounts of poverty is not something that I emotionally processed while there. And even till today, like 6 months later, it's really difficult to think about that. So, like I mentioned at the start, I'm feeling a little bit sick today, and because of that, the area behind my nose feels, you know, uncomfortable, a bit like dry cotton. In India, I had much the same experience because of the massive pollution there. I actually didn't go to a big city like Bombay or Delhi, but even in the relatively small town of Tiruvannamalai and Chidambaram, there's so many mopeds and traffic that the air is really thick with the pollution. And actually, if you climb Arunachala hill and you look out, you can't see the horizon because there's so much pollution in the air. And that was a real challenge, actually. I went to meditate, and the air does affect one's meditation because one feels like you can't fully breathe properly. My nose was constantly stuffy. My nose was constantly dripping and I had to blow my nose. So it's a bit of a technical complaint, you know, that the air in India is so dirty, but it was a challenge. On the bright side, the contrast is good, because when one comes back to a place like this, one really appreciates the fresh air. One forgets after a couple of weeks how air can feel, and then when you step into nature and you really inhale, you can feel the freshness. Something else that was challenging was the amount of garbage on the streets and all the stink associated with it. It was an extremely common sight to see pigs and chickens going through rubbish just on the side of this road and trying to get something to eat out of that. And you would also see poor people going through rubbish just to find scraps. Here in Australia we have parks, and it's actually very nice here, but we also have rubbish bins, you know, pretty much everywhere. In India I didn't see any rubbish bins at all. I went to the south of India in Tamil Nadu. Maybe it's different elsewhere, but that is actually quite hard, especially when you're trying to have a quote-unquote holy experience and you're visiting a nice temple and there's just garbage and stink everywhere. A lot of times you can smell sewage as well. When I went to Arunachala hill, the first thing I did when I arrived at the city is I just got out and I went straight up the hill with a heavy backpack. Overall I liked that hike up. It was really burning me up. But there was so much rubbish on this holy mountain. It's meant to be a holy mountain and people do revere that hill a lot. But there was so much rubbish everywhere. And right at the top was, I'll put a picture on screen, it was just a garbage pit, honestly. And that really disappointed me. But before I go off shot, I did have an insight when I was meditating about this in India, which is all this garbage, my mind doesn't like it, but in the eyes of Shiva or God, it's really a blip in the ocean. You know, all this garbage issue that we have, it's less than 100 years old. And in 1,000 years, this garbage issue also won't really be a big thing. So, although it is very unkept to treat a sacred mountain like that, I believe, in the grand scheme of things, it's okay. That hill has been there for hundreds of millions of years. Speaking of the top of Arunachala, something else that happened up there was a little bit of an extortion racket, or at least a scam. Scams were very common in India. And again, it sort of removes you from this fantasy that we want to have, that you're going on a sacred meditation trip, when people are constantly trying to rip you off or steal money or scam you. And the biggest example of this was at the top of Arunachala, where there was a group of men that claimed to be cleaning it up, you know, or looking after the mountain, and they would carry water up and they did carry oil up. So this is maybe not a complete scam, but when you go up there, the way that they approach you, you feel like you have to give a donation, or otherwise it's, you know, they don't threaten you or anything, but there's this feeling that you just should give them a donation. And so what I did is I gave them 10 bucks or something like that. But it doesn't feel good when you're going to what is in your mind such a sacred space and having intimidating guys with, you know, these guys were a bit gory, had skull necklaces around their neck and the occult pentagram tattooed on them. Having people like that at the top of a sacred mountain sort of really insisting for a donation, it doesn't feel nice. So this is really unrelated to India at all, but this is one of my favorite weeds of all time, maybe my most favorite. Why, you might ask? Well, these guys always point to the sun. Throughout the day, these leaves, the direction that they point changes. And I just find that utterly fascinating. That's such a common weed that grows in such numbers, and in general, no one wants in their gardens. It is still so intelligent, this weed. It doesn't have a nervous system, but somehow it always points its leaf at the optimal spot in the sky, the sun. And not all plants do that. So it's quite impressive. And they also make very nice flowers, and they grow a lot bigger than this. But I thought, since there's so many of them around, I should mention that. It's really a nice weed. So the last challenge that I will mention is the lack of intimacy and connection when I was in India. It was a meditation holiday. But I didn't have this guy with me to cuddle, and I didn't have my woman with me either, which meant that, you know, there's physical connection and intimacy, which is nice, wasn't there. What's wrong, Kepler? So, to conclude this topic now, it's not like India was all terrible, and these were just 5 challenges. One thing I actually liked about those challenges is that it was more of a real experience. One sees the actual human condition and the struggles that humanity is facing on a personal level. Here in Australia, if you go to a yoga studio or a meditation event, you're probably going to have incense burning and nice music playing, and everyone is dressed really well, and then afterwards you leave the room and you go have a coffee or something like that. In India, you meditate at a temple, and then you step out and you look into the eyes of a beggar that is missing an arm with rotten teeth and is going blind. The thing is, that's real. Someone is actually going through that. So we are facing these challenges head on, eye to eye. It's more of a challenging meditation experience, but there is a realness to it. So these challenges aren't negative per se. But having said that as well, there were also just abundantly positive aspects about India and my trip that I am going to share in the next video when I'm feeling a little bit healthier and a little bit more optimistic. But really, what I said in my first video when I was excited to go was to not have too many expectations, and that is something that is good to do. If you are going to India, don't have too many expectations, especially not based on what I said. Maybe your experience is totally different. Maybe you also go to somewhere more serene. But it's well worth going. Meditating in India was at a very deep level to me. Satisfying, fulfilling, not in like a smiley, happy way where you're just laughing all day long, but there was a really deep spirituality there, which is what I'll talk about more in the next video. But until then, have a great day, and Kepler sends you his love as well.